Alaikum. My name is Professor Dr. Ashir Zia. I hope all of you are fine. Due to corona pandemic, we unfortunately can't see each other, and we have to rely on electronic media. And today, I'm going to deliver a lecture on pediatric surgical problems. Unfortunately, when the baby is born or later on in life, if a child have a surgical problem, they usually don't go to straight away to the pediatric surgeon. They usually come to their pediatrician, which is a pediatric medicine specialist. So, uh, as a training of pediatrics, you must know the common pediatric surgical problems because most of the time you have to diagnose these problems and then refer these children to the pediatric surgeon. When I was doing my training in England for MRCP pediatrics, I have to uh, do a 6 months pediatric surgical uh, training as a part of my complete training program to know the common pediatric surgical problems so that when they come to a pediatrician or when a child is born with a pediatric surgical problems, he or she must be diagnosed immediately and then referred to the pediatric surgeon. So, the outline of the discussion today is the common pediatric surgical problems present in the neonatal period. The first is a congenital diaphragmatic hernia. We also called it CDH, esophageal atresia associated with the tracheoesophageal fistula, congenital hypertrophic pyloric stenosis, intussusception, Meckel's diverticulum, Hirschsprung disease, anorectal malformation, and intestinal malnutrition. We will discuss one by one. The first is congenital diaphragmatic hernia. Congenital diaphragmatic hernia, as you can see, that it present in the early life, uh, the septum transversum, uh, which is the dorsal. It is basically due to failure of the fusion of the septum transversus versum with the dorsolateral diaphragmatic process, that is a pleuroperitoneal membrane. Basically, the etiology is in during the process of organization, and there is a hole in the diaphragm which leads to the diaphragmatic hernia. There are different types of diaphragmatic hernia. There is the posterior type, which is also known as Wortolic, 90% of the cases, and then there is an anterior type which is known as Morgani, and then eventration, that is just weakness and upward eversion of the diaphragm with no actual defect. So these are the three types of diaphragmatic hernia. Posterior is the most common, 90% of the cases. Anterior is less than 10%, and eventration when there is a weakness in the diaphragm which divides the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity is just a weakness and upward eversion of the diaphragm with no actual defect present in the diaphragm wall. This is the schematic illustration of a left congenital diaphragmatic hernia showing translocation of abdominal viscera through a posterolateral aperture into the chest. Mostly the diaphragmatic hernia is present on the left side and this is the diaphragm, and on the posterolateral aspect of the diaphragm there is a hole and the intestine is going into the chest like this one, and it is causing hypoplasia of the lung, and this is the shadow of the heart, and the other lung obviously due to the pressure of the intestinal contents is also compromised. So this is a diagrammatic representation of how in, the diaphragmatic hernia present. With the herniation, the pathophysiology is that it is a ipsilateral lung hypoplasia and cyanosis. As I said, that mostly it is on the left side, and that lung obviously is go into hypoplasia when it is occupied by the contents of the abdomen. And as the contralateral lung compression also occurs due to the shifting of the mediastinum to the opposite side, the child present with the cyanosis. There is also pulmonary hypertension and right to left shunting, which is called as a persistent fetal circulation. That is a problem in association to the hypoplasia of the lungs due to the diaphragmatic hernia. Sometimes there is an ischemia of the herniated bowel due to the compression at the opening defect of the diaphragm, and the blood supply of the herniated part of the intestinal bowel in the chest is compromised and leads to ischemia of the herniated bowel. The diagnosis is nowadays mostly the diagnosis is done by ultrasound during the antenatal period when the mom goes for a repeated ultrasound scan during pregnancy. She may present with a maternal polyhydramnion, and the ultrasound can pick up the diaphragmatic hernia. It is very important if we can diagnose the diaphragmatic hernia in antenatal diagnosis, um, because such children then need to be transferred to the tertiary unit where all the pediatric surgical facilities are available, because pediatric surgical facilities are not available in every hospital or in every center. So if we know in advance that the baby who is going to be delivered is suffering from diaphragmatic hernia, then we will transfer the mother to the tertiary center where there are facilities are available to operate the child immediately after delivery, because there is always a risk in transferring baby from one hospital to the other hospital. So if we suspect that in the antenatal ultrasound that the baby has a diaphragmatic hernia. Then after birth, we can repeat the ultrasound scan. Uh, in severe cases, immediately after birth, the baby have respiratory distress, cyanosis, and gasping because of the pulmonary hypoplasia and unequal air entry and the shifting. Uh, on clinical examination, you can listen the heart shifted to the other side because of the shifting of the mediastinum, and the abdomen is empty because the bowel has gone, the intestine has gone into the chest, so the abdomen looks empty, which is known as a scaphoid abdomen. In mild cases, or those who have not diagnosed antenatally, the diagnosis is sometimes delayed because the presentation is not acute and the child is not cyanosed or not having any distress in the initial period, um, but may present with a recurrent chest infections. And if we can auscultate the chest, sometimes we find accidental auscultation of the bowel sounds in the chest that give you a clue that maybe there is a diaphragmatic hernia and the intestine has gone through the hole in the diaphragm into the chest. We need to do a chest X-ray after delivery and then arterial blood gases to see the oxygen saturation and CO2 level. We have to repeat the echo if it is not done antenatally to find out if there is any heart problems, and we can repeat the ultrasound to confirm the diagnosis and compare with the antenatal ultrasound scan. Uh, for more information, we need to do the CT of the chest to see the both lungs and the herniated part of the intestine. This is the chest X-ray showing the diaphragmatic hernia. You can see uh, very little air in the abdomen, but you can see the air present uh, in the left part of the chest, and this is the hypoplastic lung, and the heart shadow is pushed. The mediastinum is pushed towards the right side, and the the right lung is also compromised because of the shifting of the mediastinum. So the chest X-ray gives you a clue that the baby may be suffering from uh, diaphragmatic hernia if is not diagnosed antenatally. Then we can do a barium meal examination where when we put an nasogastric tube and put some gastrographin or barium and to see the lining of the intestine, and you can see that the barium has gone above into the intestine, which is present in the chest cavity, and the mediastinum has been pushed towards the right side, and this right lung is also compressed, and there is a hypoplasia of the left lung due to the presence of the intestinal loops into the chest cavity. And you can see the gastrographin has gone down into the lower part of the intestine. differential diagnosis, other causes of respiratory distress because the child can present with a respiratory distress. So the most other common causes of the respiratory distress are pneumonia, congenital maybe, or respiratory distress syndrome (RDS) when there is a deficiency of the surfactant, especially in the premature babies. Uh, when we suspect, as far as the management is concerned, when we suspect a case of a diaphragmatic hernia, we must put a nasogastric tube to decompress the air present in the stomach so that it will not affect the lung because of the distension of the intestinal loops. If the child is cyanosed and have severe hypoxemia, then we have to put an endotracheal tube and put the child on ventilator. We because we can't give uh, feed, so we have to put the child on IV fluids. We keep the child in in a, in a an incubator or in a warmer to keep the baby in a warm position, atmosphere, uh, and we must admit her into the neonatal ICU where there are all the facilities present to look after a newborn baby. The operation usually, if the baby is born in a tertiary center, we immediately transfer the baby because the surgeon already know that a baby with a diaphragmatic hernia is going to deliver. So the transfer is very easy within the hospital from pediatric intensive care unit to the pediatric surgical unit. But if a baby is born or undiagnosed antenatally in a primary or secondary unit, then you have to contact the, your referral center where there is a pediatric surgical facilities are available, and then to transfer the baby in a portable incubator with a nurse and doctor to the respective tertiary center where the child is obviously uh, examined and then managed accordingly. The operation is usually either through the abdominal approach, which is a subcostal incision, or a reduction of the then the reduction of the contents. You have to pull the intestine contents back into the abdomen, and the third part of the operation is to repair the defect. These are parts, different stages of the operation. When you go through the abdominal wall, you pull all the intestinal contents into the abdominal cavity and then repair the defect present into the uh, diaphragm. This is the schematic drawing of the unreduced left congenital diaphragmatic hernia as seen from the abdomen. The same hernia but now reduced sutures have been placed for a primary repair, complete primary repair of a left congenital diaphragmatic hernia, and the repaired left congenital diaphragmatic hernia using prosthetic material. This sorry. I think something happened. Next case is a esophageal atresia and tracheoesophageal fistula. When esophageal atresia is when the esophagus is not connected uh, from mouth to the upper part of the stomach, and somewhere in between it is not developed, which is known as esophageal atresia, and this is often associated with a fistula that connected with the trachea, which is known as a tracheoesophageal fistula. So it is an abnormality, not common, but you can see few cases of in a year where there is a lot of babies are born, and sometimes there is just esophageal atresia with no fistula, or sometimes there is a esophageal atresia associated with a tracheoesophageal fistula. Esophageal atresia, which is EA, is an interruption or discontinuity in the esophagus, and the tracheoesophageal fistula is an abnormal communication between trachea and esophagus. Esophageal atresia may be present, as I mentioned before, with or without tracheoesophageal fistula. Tracheoesophageal fistula may be present with or without esophageal atresia. Etiology is usually incomplete partitioning of a primary foregut, uh, foregut when there is a formation of the different organs of the body. You must have read in your embryology. These are different types of esophageal atresia. In this picture, this is just a type, just esophageal atresia with no fistula, and there is a gap between the esophagus and the upper part of the stomach. In this case, there is a fistula between the upper part of the esophagus with the trachea. In this type, there is a communication between the lower part of the esophagus to the fistula, to the trachea, and the upper part of the esophagus is blind. In this type, the both upper and the lower part of the esophagus are connected with the trachea, so there is a double fistula. In this variety, the continuity of the esophagus is present, but there is a fistula between esophagus and the trachea, and this is known as H type of fistula. It looks like a figure H. So these are the different types of esophageal atresia with and without different types of fistula. This is present in the 6% of the cases when there is just esophageal atresia. This is very rare. It is present in the 2% of the cases where there is communication between the upper part of the esophagus and trachea. In most of the cases, which is 85% of the cases, the lower part of the esophagus is attached via fistula to the trachea, and the upper part of the esophagus is blind. In 1% of the cases, both the upper and the lower part of the esophagus are connected via fistula to the trachea, and in 2% of the cases, there is a H type of fistula present between esophagus and the trachea. So, in most of the cases, which is about 85% of the cases, there is a blind end of the esophagus with no continuity, and the lower part of the esophagus is attached to via fistula to the trachea. When the baby is born, is usually there is a failure of swallowing. Baby is unable to take feed and eventually becomes dehydration. And because it's not taking any food like milk, so they go hypoglycemia develop in the baby. As there is a obstruction which is usually a proximal, then there is a chance that once the baby being fed, the milk is not going into the stomach because of the discontinuity of the esophagus. So the chances of aspiration are quite high. The milk goes into the wrong direction into the trachea, and the baby develops aspiration pneumonia. In distal fistula, there is a regurgitation of the acid into the stomach, uh, and causes severe pneumonia. Diagnosis, usually there is a maternal history of polyhydramnion because the child is not taking uh, the drinking the fluid or is unable to absorb the fluid. So the lot of uh, amniotic fluid is present in the mother's womb leads to a polyhydramnion. There is an excessive, when the baby is born, there is an excessive salivation. Lot of secretions are coming from the baby's mouth, or maybe he is drooling, coughing, choking, or cyanosis during the first oral feeding. Once you give the baby feed, become suddenly out of breath, started coughing and choking, and sometimes become flu. There may be a chemical or aspiration pneumonia, the inability to pass a nasogastric tube into the stomach. That is a very important finding that mostly once the baby is born, the nurses pass the nasogastric tube and aspirate and check the acid contents on a litmus paper. But in this case, there is inability to pass a nasogastric tube into the stomach because of the esophageal atresia. If we take a chest X-ray, it will show the coiling of the tube into the upper mediastinum. Um, there may be gastrointestinal gas. uh, you have to do a contrast study to check uh, the esophageal atresia. Tracheoesophageal fistula with atresia present with a recurrent aspiration also. There are many syndromes associated with esophageal atresia. There is one syndrome called Vactral, VACTERL, where every word stands with abnormality. V stand there is a vertebral abnormalities. A there is an anorectal abnormality. C cardiac abnormality. D tracheoesophageal fistula present in the 50% of cases. E stands for esophageal atresia. R stands for renal abnormalities. and L stands for abnormalities of the limb, so that other investigation may be done as required, like abdominal ultrasound, echo, X-ray of the spine, to find out the other abnormalities. So this is one of the rare syndrome known as vectoral syndrome, where there are other abnormalities associated with the tracheoesophageal fistula and esophageal atresia. So the moral is that if you find a child with a tracheoesophageal fistula, you have to look for the other abnormalities as I have mentioned. The management preoperative preparation is we put a nasogastric tube and we don't give baby oral feeding. So baby was is put on NPO. Uh, we continuously suck the nasogastric tube because there are continuous production of the secretions and then can lead to aspiration pneumonia. So we attach the nasogastric tube to low suction apparatus. Um, the baby is admitted to a neonatal intensive care unit, put in a supine and elevated position to 30 to 40 degree in the incubator with oxygen, um, endotracheal intubation if the baby is blue, and oxygen saturation is not maintaining oxygen saturation. We give IV fluids and also put the child on broad spectrum antibiotics prophylactically because there are chances of uh, aspiration pneumonia in these babies. Look for the other abnormalities as I mentioned, the abnormalities in the vertebra or endorectal or cardiac, extra urgent surgical repair after rapid preoperative preparation. So if the baby is delivered in a primary or secondary unit, then we have to contact the tertiary unit to a pediatric surgeon for further management. The operation is usually a low risk infant should get primary repair. Sometimes it is difficult to repair in one go, so you have to do multiple operations to um, repair the primary defect. The high risk babies get gastrostomy. If there are problems in establish the continuity os- of the esophageal atresia, then you make a hole into the stomach and start feeding from that hole. Put a tube called gastrostomy tube and give start feeding from the gastrostomy. Then you have to open the right thoracotomy through the left through the fourth intercostal space and operate and try to the restoration of the esophagus to end-to-end anastomosis. It's because this is a big operation and quite complicated sometimes. So it is associated with the complication. The early complications are an ostomatic leak where you connect the two parts of the esophagus. They can be leak. There may be a recurrent tracheoesophageal fistula or sometimes the trachea collapse, which is known as trachomalacia. The late complications are development of the structure where you do anastomosis of the esophagus in 25% of the cases. Sometimes the milk comes into the wrong direction, which is known as the gastroesophageal reflux, present in 50% of the cases, and sometimes the motility is not established, which is called dysmobility, which is present in almost every case of a child with esophageal atresia with or without fistula. We'll discuss another problem, common problem then, which is known as a congenital hypertrophic pyloric stenosis. This is a common problem between the ages of 2 and 8 weeks, present with vomiting. The pathophysiology is that there is a muscular hypertrophy of all the layers of the pylorus, most significant in the circular layer, causing pyloric stenosis and gradual gastric outlet obstruction. The child presents with a repeated vomiting, and usually the vomiting is quite projectile at around 4 to 6 weeks of life, and there is a losses of fluid. The child is usually very hungry and dehydrated. They usually take feed very quickly and then vomit. There is a increased peristalsis. The symptoms usually start, as I mentioned, around about 2 to 3 weeks after birth, not since birth. They are usually fine in the first 3 to 4 weeks of life. And there is a persistent, progressive, projectile, non-bilious vomiting. It is very important to know that in pyloric stenosis, the there is a non-bilious vomiting. That means the bile is not present in the vomitus. Baby is usually hungry and feeds vigorously, but after taking feeds, it vomits quite vigorously, and the vomitus goes quite far from the baby. The signs are that the baby is dehydration, weight loss, as due to dehydration, the baby is passing less urine, so there is oliguria, and sometimes there is a jaundice present. If you examine the abdomen, there is a distension of the epigastrium, and sometimes you can see the visible gastric peristalsis. If you palpate the abdomen, you can feel the pyloric tumor, which is usually a pathognomic sign of pyloric stenosis. Some, if the history is suggestive, then you can do a barium meal. For cases with difficulty in diagnosis, you can see the distension of the stomach, strong gastric waves, elongated and narrow pyloric canal, which is known as a strict sign, and delayed gastric emptying. Mostly nowadays, the pyloric stenosis is diagnosed through ultrasound scan. In the lab, you see, because of the vomiting, you see less sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride, called hypochloremic metabolic alkalosis. If you check the blood gases, you will see the pH is showing the alkalosis. Uh, there is an indirect hyperbilirubinemia due to propranolol transferase deficiency in these babies. This is an ultrasound scan of a child with pyloric stenosis, showing the string sign. This is the barium meal, which showing the elongated pyloric canal and delayed emptying of the stomach. and this is a tail because of the obstruction, showing the small streak of the contrast. This is abdomen, but the barium is not passing through the, the pyloric canal, and very small amount is going beyond that. This is known as a string sign, is like a string. Preoperative preparations of a child. If you diagnose a child suffering from pyloric stenosis, there is no urgency, but you have to refer the child to pediatric surgeon as soon as possible because he or she should be operated in a pediatric surgical unit. You have to hydrate the baby before operation, so there is a need of a good hydration by IV fluids, correction of the electrolytes like sodium, potassium, chloride, and also correction of the metabolic alkalosis is very important before operation. Usually, the operation called Ramsted's pyloromyotomy, where you divide the muscle, they, they transfer right upper abdomen incision, and the intraoperative findings are usually olive-shaped mass, which is 2 to 3 centimeters in length, pale in color, feels like a cartilage, incision in the anterosuperior surface, and avoid perforation. This is the diaphragm. If you open the abdomen, you will see a olive-shaped mass, and there is an obstruction. So you give an incision uh, to divide the muscle, but not the mucosa. This is the diagrammatic. There are different stages. This is A, B, and C, and basically you have to divide the muscle to relieve the obstruction. There are different steps of the operation. There are photographs showing the olive-shaped mass, and there is a the incision has given it to divide the muscles, and this is our pyloromyotomy have been completed. And post-operatively, the infants are usually maintained on IV fluids for a few hours, and usually after 24 to 48 hours, you have to introduce the oral feeding, and they are allowed to resume, uh, as I mentioned, gradual oral feeding at the same time while they are on IV fluids, because initially you give small amount of oral feed, and once uh, they started tolerating, you gradually reducing IV fluids and increasing the oral uh, uh, feeds, and they usually discharge after 24 to 48 hours if there are no complications. Thank you very much. I think we will discuss other surgical problems in another lecture. And if you have any question, you can ask me, you can email me. My email address is rzia56 at hotmail.com. My mobile number is 0300 8440973, and my WhatsApp number is same 0300 8440973. I hope this will help you to understand the pediatric surgical problems which presents in the very early age of a newborn baby. Thank you very much.